Hey everybody. So in this video we're learning about the history and the background of what the world was like when the theory of evolution was developed by scientists. Because the development of evolution as an idea really was a revolution in the way that humans think about living things. So it's really good to get a background of the history and the scientists that were working at the time before we learn about the actual theory of evolution itself. So our story starts back in the late 1700s, the late 18th century. So this is what it looked like at the time, much of Europe and America. Australia was only discovered by Europeans in 1770, so Australia was barely a country, well, a modern country. Of course, indigenous people were living there. And at the time, the church was still really powerful, and even though the Renaissance had happened in the 1600s and scientific thought was becoming more accepted by people, the church was still really powerful, and stories and beliefs from the Bible were still pretty much taken as correct by everyone. So the first person we meet in our story is James Hutton, and this is around 1795. So James Hutton, he was a Scottish geologist. So he studied rocks and the earth. And in 1795, he published his theory, which was basically the first theory of how the earth geology works. So his theory included how layers of rock build up over time and how the oldest layers of rock can be found at the bottom, including all the fossils that are in there, and that newer and newer layers of rock get deposited on top of those. And that meant that fossils we discovered down in the lowest layers of rocks, these are really old fossils. And in some cases, these are from animals and plants that don't even exist anymore, that have been extinct. So it's the first time that people started to realize that actually, over time, species have changed and some have died out and new species have come in. It hasn't just been everything living on Earth at the moment is how things have been forever, because that's what religion and Christianity had believed. And James Hutton, through all his work, he's basically considered the father of modern geology. He started it all. The next important development is from this guy called Thomas Malthus. And he was a biologist from England. He developed a theory where he realized that populations of organisms, in theory, they can increase exponentially. Because, and if we think about how viruses grow, that if every organism creates two organisms, then suddenly the population and the numbers can explode and increase really quickly with exponential growth. But the problem is that every environment that species live in, there aren't unlimited resources. So there's always a point where the population can't grow any further because of the resources where the populations live. So these kangaroos, they're going to be limited by the amount of grass there is to grow, to eat, by the space there is to move around, and other kangaroos nearby as well. So populations have a limit. And he also realized that over time, populations generally stay the same. Populations are mostly stable. Okay, so the next person to come along was JeanBaptiste Lamarck. So he was a Frenchman. He came up with the first theory of how animals and plants evolve. Today we know that his theory was wrong, but like always in science at the time, there were some people that supported it. So his theory was called acquired inheritance. So the classic example of Lamarck's theory is with giraffes and their long necks. So according to Lamarck's theory, if a living thing uses a particular trait a lot, then that trait increases, and then they pass that trait on to their children. So here's one explanation of how giraffes got their long neck would be that as giraffes stretch up to try and reach high branches to eat food, then the more they keep stretching their neck and the more they keep using those muscles, the longer their neck will grow. So eventually, by the end of a giraffe's lifetime, it will have a long neck, and then it passes it on to its children. So it's really that individuals, they acquire or they gain traits in their life and then these are passed on to the next generation. So he had a lot of support for his theory, but there was a competing theory coming along not too far down the track, and that's the one that we know today. So, the next person we meet is Charles Darwin himself. Probably the most famous person in developing the theory of evolution. Here he is as a young 21-year-old. So Darwin was, originally he started studying medicine in England, but he wasn't enjoying studying it, and he found surgery to be disgusting because we didn't have any modern anesthetics or anything. So he soon quit studying medicine, and eventually he started studying biology to become a naturalist, someone who studies the natural world. And when he was 21, he joined on this voyage aboard the HMS Beagle, which was a ship that set off from England, and the goal of the voyage was to chart the southern area of South America, which hadn't been mapped very well at the time. So when the boat set off, this was in 1831, Darwin was aboard, and while the others were doing mapping, he studied the natural world. So everywhere they visited, he collected specimens, he observed things, and his most famous discoveries were in the Galapagos Islands, off the coast of South America. So in the Galapagos Islands, he noticed there were lots of species of finches, these little birds, that seemed really closely related, but they all had slightly different beaks. And he saw that the shape of the beak was an adaptation to where that bird lived and what it ate. So the finches with big beaks, they had adapted to eating seeds that needed to be crunched, and then the finches with small beaks, they ate insects, and they pushed their beak into bark to get insects out. So he noticed that in similar and closely related species, they had different beak adaptations. And the same thing with giant tortoises too. So here are the Galapagos Islands. There are a few species of giant tortoise that live on the islands, and they're all closely related, except they have slightly different adaptations too. So closely related species, they live near each other, and they have slight differences. So on his journey on the Beagle, Darwin collected all these specimens, but he didn't really know the importance of them until later on in his career. So throughout the next 20 years, really, through the 1840s and 1850s, he continued studying, and he was slowly developing this idea of how different species evolve and adapt. And another important idea on the way to that is how he noticed that domestic animals and domestic plants, like carrots and like pigeons, humans have slowly changed their characteristics over time. So breeders who breed pigeons, they select particular offspring based on a feature that they like until over time they develop a single breed that looks similar. And the same with carrots and all our other domesticated crops. And Darwin called this artificial selection, because humans come in and we select which individuals we like, and we make them breed to continue on to the next generation. So that was a key idea for Darwin on how he developed his theory of natural selection, which we'll come to. The next person in the story is Alfred Wallace. This is another British naturalist, and he was inspired by Darwin and a lot of other naturalists to go and travel and study the natural world too. So at the same time Darwin was working in the 1840s and 50s, Alfred Wallace was travelling the world and studying lots of different ecosystems. So he went to, his first big journey was to South America, to the Amazon. And he noticed there that two different types of monkeys, two different species, lived on either side of the Amazon River. So we have the river, we have species A and species B. So he noticed that different species tend to be on either side of a landform, like a mountain or a river, or on an island. And he noticed this as well over in Indonesia, where he noticed that there was different species on either side of this narrow ocean. So by about 1858, Wallace and Darwin, so they were both working away on their own, they didn't really communicate much, they both came up with the theory of natural selection almost at the exact same time. So they were trying to figure out how can similar species change over time and how can they make new species. So in 1858, Wallace and Darwin, they both presented and published their theory of natural selection. So amazingly, it was the same year and they hadn't been working together at all. This happens a lot in science, where often a big breakthrough happens in completely different areas of the world at the same time. So after they presented their papers, not much really changed. A few scientists recognized the theory, but not many people believed it or did any extra work. And it wasn't until 1859, when Darwin published his famous book, The Origin of Species, that a few more scientists started to get on board with his theory. But it still wasn't adapted straight away by everyone. So there's one more person in the story who is sort of the final piece in the puzzle. And his name is Gregor Mendel. So Mendel, he was a monk, and he did lots of experiments on genetics. So he's the first person to figure out how genes have alleles, and that different alleles can pass from one parent to the next generation. And his work was published in 1865, but it wasn't actually discovered by science until 1900. So we have the ideas of natural selection that came from Darwin and Wallace. So they developed that in the 1850s. And then we had Mendel's ideas of genetics, which he developed in the 1880s. But the real key was in the 20th century, when scientists started to combine these ideas together. So we started to realize that genetics is the cause of all that variation in a population, and that's how natural selection happens. So in the early 20th century, about the 1930s to the 1940s, scientists combined these ideas into the modern theory of evolution that we know today. And this is called the modern synthesis. So that's the background. And next video we'll learn what the theory of evolution actually is and how we have evidence for it as well.